It's great to see all of you here today as we have our first part of advancing just energy for all through transportation. Rosa Parks' birthday passed on February the 4th, and she was a woman of faith with the AME Church. She noted that when she was reflecting on her work and act of resistance, she said, I quote, "I felt the Lord would give me the strength to endure whatever I had to face. God did away with all fear. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down, and I refused to move." And in her act of faithfulness, she was part of a larger movement to affirm God's dignity of all people, for access to transportation, to justice and civil rights. And that has really led to a change in our country as well. And I wanted to use her words and to acknowledge her because we are also in Black History Month, and the work and the conversations that we are having around transportation is about justice for all in our communities. So thank you for joining us. This is our first part of how we as United Methodist Women and as people of faith can advance just energy for all, specifically through transportation. My name is Elizabeth Tunhe Lee. I serve as the Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice at United Methodist Women. And I reside normally in Queens, New York, which is occupied Lenape land. We would love to hear who is here with us as well. So would you be able to type in the chat box your name, where you are calling from, whose land that you are on, and if you are a United Methodist Woman, if you could type in your role and affiliation in the chat box as well. And what are your preferred pronouns? For me, mine are she and they. As you do that, we will also be putting up a poll just to get a sense of who is with us as well. Are you a member of UMW? What is your UMW jurisdiction? And have you participated in previous trainings? Just as a reminder, if we could make sure we're muted during our conversation so we could hear the speakers as well. Estelle, sorry, I'm going to mute you. Hearing you on the side, but hello. And Erin, is our poll up?
It is not, but let me know when you're ready.
Yes, and if we could also post the poll.
All right, poll is launched.
Thank you.
Excuse me for interrupting, but the poll just showed up for a brief second and disappeared.
All right. Thank you for letting us know, Rhonda. Sounds like the poll was closed prematurely. Let me try that again. Okay. And for those of you that are co-hosts, you actually won't be able, I don't know that you can participate in the poll. So maybe just let it sit on your screen for a second. Otherwise it might close out.
And we have about 80 of you who have already filled out the poll, so we'll give you another 5 seconds. Okay, So we have about 98% who are from UMW, and welcome to those who are friends of UMW. We have about 25% from Western, 25% from Southeast, 15% from North Central, 15% from North Central, Northeast and South Central, and a few of you who don't know, and don't worry about that. And about 65% of you have participated in a former Just Energy for All training or webinar, and it's great to see that number increase. And I'm just looking at the chat box. There are so many of you. Thank you from all over throughout the United States, and some from outside the US as well. And for our next activity, we are planning to have a prayer from Kanda Kawamba, who is from DR Congo, who has been joining us in our conversations. Kanda, can you hear us? There was some connection problems before. So Kanda, Erin, do you know if Kanda's there with us?
Kanda is here.
Great.
Oh, I think actually we may have lost her again, unfortunately.
Okay, so I know we have many saints here. Is there anyone who would like to pray, who has not prayed during our time together before?
Shall I pray?
Yes, please do. Thank you, Rhonda.
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we all come to you at this time in hopes that you will guide us with your teachings and your principles, ways to protect our climate in a peaceful and loving way while we spread the love of God and the peace of Jesus Christ. I pray that we all get valuable information from this meeting, and that the rest of our days are safe, healthy, and happy. In this, I pray to you in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for stepping in, Rhonda. And we hope that Kanda is doing well. She joined us earlier to check in. So, but thank you, Rhonda. As always, as United Methodist Women, I want to remind us of our sisterhood of grace, even when we are not physically together, that we listen actively with head and heart, that we speak from our own experience, that we're aware of our body language, even when we're on our screens, that we respect confidentiality, that we own our intentions and our impacts, that we practice sustainability. So if there are any lights in your home that are on in other rooms, I encourage you to turn them off if it's not needed. And to expect unfinished business, both discomfort and joy, because there'll be a lot that will be presented, and some things we may want to go back and reflect on as we move forward. So I'm really excited about our lineup today. We have three amazing speakers. We'll first hear from one of our very own United Methodist Women leaders, Carla Burton, and she'll be speaking about climate justice and transportation and how it's impacting her community in Greensboro, North Carolina. She is mission coordinator for social action, the UMW at St. Matthew's UMC. She's also the chairperson at St. Matthew's UMC in Creation Care Ministry and Community Garden. We have Denise Abdul Rahman, who is the regional field organizer in the Midwest and Plain States at NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And we're so privileged to have Denise. She has been a partner with United Methodist Women, NAACP as well as a whole, but Denise with our Solar Equity Initiative and a variety of opportunities. And especially when we think about the Midwest and North Central jurisdiction, she has been working with our Be Just Be Green jurisdictional guides and others in collaboration opportunities as well. So Denise, we're so excited that you're here with us. And Denise will be speaking about advancing justice for all through transportation. And our third speaker will be Bob Youngke, who is on the policy team as part of Elders Climate Action. He's also the co-chair of the U.S. Climate Action Network, the VICA Transportation Subcommittee. And I've had the privilege of being able to be on committee calls with Bob, especially as he has been focusing and really helping us think about the transportation sector. He used to work with Environmental Defense Fund as well as their senior attorney, and so has a lot of content knowledge as well for to share. And he'll be looking at transportation climate change and opportunities for engagement. So those are our three speakers who'll be giving us insights and intel. And as a reminder for United Methodist Women, we engage in the work because we recognize to advance climate justice, we need to address the transportation sector. It's one of the main contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, not only in terms of emissions in terms of how it's warming our planet, it's also a major contributor to air pollution that is impacting every single part of our organs. And it has disproportionate impact on communities of color, children, and not only in the United States, but in the global South as well. We have statements within the United Methodist Church in our Book of Resolutions that guide our direction around both emissions reduction, air pollution, our energy policy statements. And so for one instance, 1001 of the Book of Resolutions Energy Policy Statement notes the importance of both supporting government funding, research, and policies to advance renewable energy and eliminate fossil fuels. So I just wanted to note those as some grounding components. United Methodist Women is also part of the U.S. Climate Action Network. And as part of that, over the several years, the U.S. the network created the Vision for Equitable and Climate Action. And that is a document that really gives policy directions and a North Star in terms of where we need to go to. And there is a section on transportation that really delineates what we need to do to ensure that we stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius and we can adequately address the climate crisis, ensuring that equity and justice are centered. So just wanted to frame our conversation with that information. And as we begin, I wanted to ask you, and if you could write in the chat box, how is the transportation system or sector or transportation in general impacting you and or your community? Whether there's a lack of transit access, whether there's impact in terms of your community because of the air pollution, or other things that you may want to know. So we wanted to hear from you to inform us collectively how we are already being impacted by the transportation sector. So please type in your comments throughout our time. I also invite you to type in any questions that you may have, and I'll be collecting that as we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. So I want to now hand it over to Carla Burton, who will be speaking around climate justice and transportation in our context. So Carla, thanks for joining us. I'll hand it over to you. And if you want to share your screen, you should be able to do that.
Thank you, Liz. Give me one moment to share the screen. Okay, can everyone see that? All right. So recently I was a panelist for Transit Equity Days. It was a new experience for me, but as Liz was explaining at first, it is in commemoration of Rosa Parks and her effort in Montgomery, Alabama to combat segregation and so forth. So this is a summary of what I did. So I'm Carla Burton. I'm a Christian, a member of United Methodist Women, mission coordinator for social action, St. Matthew's United Methodist Church, Greensboro, North Carolina. Originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, I can appreciate the beauty of the parks, mountains, and beaches in our area. I'm also an avid swimmer, as you can tell by my pictures. So I spend a great deal of time outdoors, especially in the summertime. I am a YMCA swim instructor. So in 2019, I went to the Creation Care Summit in Nashville, Tennessee, and was invited to participate in the Just Energy for All training. And so just to review, the Just Energy for All campaign works for energy that is cleaner and more just for all of God's people and creation. So today I want to talk a little bit about the environmental impact of mass transit and equal access. Those are two issues that I have experienced with firsthand in my area, Greensboro, North Carolina, the Triad, North Carolina. Climate change, as we all know, is not impossible to overcome. As a member of United Methodist Women, one of our 2021 to 2024 mission priorities is climate justice. I am mission coordinator for social action, so I'm trying to become more involved in these types of issues. As a student in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, from 2014 to 2017, I rode a Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation bus, which commutes between all of the Triad cities. I rode between Greensboro and Winston-Salem, in addition to utilizing the local bus systems in each city. Usually passengers are male commuters to school or work, and predominantly people of color. One hurdle during my time as a regular commuter was access. For example, it would take me 40 minutes to get to the bus stop to go to the downtown depot in Greensboro. I would transfer to a park bus that would take me to Winston-Salem. Then I would have to get on a Winston-Salem Transit Authority vehicle or WISTA and continue on to school, but my total commute time was about 2.5 hours per day. So for example, someone with mobility issues would have a more difficult time, or they would have even a more increased travel time and so forth to get from just school to work or home to school or the grocery store or something like that. Where there are discriminatory attitudes, decision making regarding equal access, as we all know, can be a very serious issue. I was thankful to have reliable transportation, though the park fleet doesn't have any environment-friendly vehicles. The city of Greensboro does have several electric battery rechargeable vehicles, but WISTA does not. Here's a picture of one of the battery operated vehicles from GTA, or the city of Greensboro bus system. Quality of life for all residents in the Triad, North Carolina, stands to be improved with the addition of non-fossil fuel energy source vehicles, given the reduction in CO2 emissions and use of an alternative fuel energy source. Only a small percentage of the world's population in sustained action is required to make a difference in the trend of climate change, excuse me. Increasing awareness and accessibility may too result in more residents opting to commute via mass transit, which is another way to lower greenhouse gas emissions and combat global warming. I feel like we need to be more personally accountable. We need to lobby our politicians and so forth, or continue to, that people might begin to get the message about climate change and the little things that we can do on an individual basis to make a difference. Thank you so much. And I know that addressing this issue will make a big difference in the lives and health of our local residents, people around the world, by lessening air pollution and by helping to preserve and love our world. So God bless you all. And I hope that this presentation has been an inspiration.
Carla, thank you so much for sharing and providing that context, both in terms of a bit of more of who you are and wow, having to use transportation 2.5 hours per day just to get around, and acknowledging those who are differently abled would have even more challenges, and just the opportunities that we have to engage. So thank you so much, Carla. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Denise Abdul Rahman, and she'll be speaking to us around advancing just energy for all through transportation. Denise, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Liz, and to all of the United Methodist women. Such an honor and a privilege to be able to join you today, and I look forward to the ongoing transformational and radical change that we can create together. Again, my name is Denise Abdul-Rahman, and I serve the NAACP in the Environmental Climate Justice Program. And I would like to just kind of ground a little bit about my ancestry of freedom fighters who've been fighting for a just transition for a long time, from my mother who advocated for a Head Start program, to her going to Beijing, China, advocating for women's rights. In fact, she was a diversity director for women at the Fort Wayne Women's Bureau. So, and my grandmother, who was a Stark civil rights leader, who went to the March for Jobs for Justice in 1963, and my father, who was a civil rights activist, who showed up at the Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana during the time of Mayor Hatchard. And so I like to just share a long line of freedom fighters, and then I like to share the context of a people that I come from, that I claim in my ancestry of African descent, that have a yin and a yang with transportation relationship, having been transported to the Americas and other places during the Middle Passage and the transatlantic. To the time of Harriet Tubman, who was searching for freedom and needing transit to free her people, and was a stark environmental justice leader of her time, using Moss and the North Star to lead her people to freedom. I'd like to put on just a brief video that I think kind of encapsulates a lot around just transition and the plight of some people as it relates to transit, as it relates to climate, as it relates to just energy. I might need to clear back out, sorry, to make sure that I share the screen for the video. Apologies.
The thing about hip hop today is it's smart, it's insightful.
Let hip hop lead the way to a great future.
We could see a much deeper economic downturn.
Global warming is real.
Fires have been fueled by a high rate of asthma.
Stated by Katrina. Were sure to follow, and now they are.
Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment.
Yeah, I make the track sound good. And do that, got a message for the hood. It's time to go green, we gotta go green. The food ain't fresh and the air ain't clean. From the hood to the birds, everybody go scream.
Dr. King, we live in your dream. My president is black, but it's going green. So my president is black, but it's going green. I said my president is black, but it's going green. I got my president back, now we do the same thing.
Now why your little cousin got asthma? Auntie got cancer. I know you know the problem, but you never knew the answer. You want the answer? Listen to my stanza. When it come to cold, they be stripping like the dancer. Who the company and who the boss like Tony Dancer? Maybe one day we probably get a chance to have a conversation about conservation. Rather condemnation, for compensation. Look, I'm from the hood. We need better food and better air. You probably wouldn't never care. You ain't never there. Rappers never rap about it. They rather act hard. Why these companies doing toxic in my backyard? I'm from the hood. The refinery ain't that far. Something like my neighbor ain't doing me no favors. We need more classes, not more sales. Man, we need green jobs. We don't need no jails. I said it's time to go green. We gotta go green. The food ain't fresh and the air ain't clean. From the hood to the birds, everybody go scream.
Dr. King, we live in your dream. My president is black,
most need work. With the work that most need done, we need funds. We can harness the sun, we can harness the wind, we can create jobs for my family and friends. Now when I say I'm going green to the hood, it sound funny, but I'm talking about saving the earth and getting money. I'm talking about hundreds, thousands, and M's. Do that, go pull up in a hybrid on rims. So when I hit the block, y'all, the song go knock y'all. Car on E, but the car won't stop, y'all. It's electric, so it's guaranteed to shock y'all. Yeah, I'm going green and I'm straight from the block, y'all. I want the green Bentley, I ain't talking about the paint. I'm talking about the one with biofuel in the tank. So many leaders paved the way for the leaders of today. These are shoulders that we stand on, now we all hands on.
America can create millions of well-paid, green-collar jobs. We can make our streets safer and our communities healthier. We can save the planet for our children and our children's children. That is the promise of a green economy.
It's time to go green, we gotta go green. The food ain't fresh and the air ain't clean. From the hood to the birds, everybody go scream.
Dr. King, we live in your dream. My president is black, but it's going green. So my president is black, but it's going green. I said my president is black, but it's going green. I got my president back, and I'ma do the same thing.
And we will put Americans to work, making our homes and buildings more efficient so that we can save billions of dollars on our energy bills. We need to ultimately make clean, renewable energy the profitable kind of energy. Develop technologies like wind power and solar power, advanced biofuel, and more.
Thank you.
Thank you for, whoops.
The thing about hip hop,
So thank you for listening to that, and hopefully you can see the broad intersectionality of how the transportation and a just transition is all connected. And we are proponents of a strategic framework called the Just Transition, which ask us to resist and to rethink and to restructure, to pretty much stop all the bad, the extractive economy, and to work toward building the new and the living economy, which of course is inclusive of transit. And our program is built to stop the environmental injustices, including climate change, that disproportionately impact communities of color and low-income communities in the United States and around the world. And our program was created to provide resources to our members and community leadership in addressing this human and civil rights. And we advocate for three objectives: to reduce harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse emissions. And we combine this on action to shutting down coal plants and other toxic facilities, as well as stopping the building of new toxic facilities. And we work to advocate to strengthen and monitor and to look at the enforcement of regulations at the federal, state, and local level. And also it includes a focus on assuring corporate responsibility and accountability. And we work toward advancing energy efficiency and clean energy. We work with members at the state level on campaigns to pass renewable energy and energy efficiency, while simultaneously working at the local level with small businesses and unions on developing demonstration projects to ensure that communities are accessing the revenue generation opportunities in the new energy economy, and providing safer, more sustainable mechanisms for managing energy needs for the community and beyond. And lastly, we work to strengthen the community's resilience and livability. And that includes that we work with the communities to ensure that they're equipped to engage in sustainability and climate action planning that integrates policies and practices such as advancing food justice and advocating for transportation equity and upholding human rights in emergency management and facilitating a participatory process. And these are our members in Iowa that are working to deploy solar on Mount Zion Baptist Church. This is President Sidnor in Cleveland, Ohio, and she is fighting for clean air in her community. Asthma hits Black people particularly hard, and the healthcare system often fails them. There's an estimated 15.3% of Black children that have the disease, compared to 7.1% of their white counterparts. And this is President Haley in Illinois. And she has fought to shut down the Dahlman coal plant in Illinois. At the same time, she has fought for electric vehicle buses via the Volkswagen settlement, and she's advocated to training young people to deploy energy efficiency. And this is a youth named Trayvon Moore. He's a youth leader in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they're doing a lot on food sovereignty, which is leading a sustainable lifestyle by growing the food and stopping the shipping waste, the fuel consumption associated with produce transportation, and many other environmental issues. So lifting up that the more local our food systems are, then the less transportation is required. Here is where we did a Power Up pilot program, training some people on solar BIPOC community. And the challenges here was that they were trained, they were actually hired by the IBEW union, but the utility scale solar site was 30 miles out, and transportation became an issue. And we quickly began to try to figure out how we could create a transportation system that would give them access to those jobs. And this is advocacy just around young people that live near polluting systems, where they were taught how to test their soil, air, and water. And our Gary branch that works on climate action planning in Gary, which is incorporating transit. And our Duluth, Minnesota branch, they participated in Transit Equity Day that we recently had. And they took members on a ceremonial ride on the 11th route bus stop to remember and to honor the American transportation system and the civil rights icon. This is a reference from the Institute of Policy Studies, which is indicating how transportation is the largest and fastest growing source for United States greenhouse gas emissions. 29% of the US emissions in 2017 compared to 27.5 for electricity generation. 22% growth in emissions from 1990 to 2017 compared to 9% for agriculture. And vehicle miles traveled decreased from 2007 through 2011, but has started growing again. Obviously, the consequences and impacts hurt the most vulnerable people worst: people of color, indigenous, low income, and people in the global South. And other harmful environmental effects of our transportation system, such as nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter emissions, asthma and other respiratory diseases, land use and sprawl. Again, vulnerable communities are hardest hit. And a 2017 study found that striking racial disparities in transportation related to nitrogen dioxide. And just wanted to lift up some things around just electrical vehicle buses and school buses for the health of the drivers and the passengers and students, really trying to create policies that will at least convert school buses to electric vehicle buses so our children aren't inhaling those diesel fuels on a regular basis. And that, yes, African Americans and low income live near these polluting highways. And so there is a dire need to electrify and to become more pragmatic or sustainable in our transit system. And something I want to just say earlier was that, you know, climate solutions may be inevitable, but equity is not. Looking at electric vehicle access and electric vehicle affordability, the transition of charging stations, transportation, high-speed rail, where that goes, and then all of the job proponents that come with that, and minority business enterprise and women business enterprise contract opportunities, access to the again, to the jobs like way out on wind farms and utility scale solar projects. And then again, just actual food access, localizing the food reduces the need for as much transit in some of our communities. And I'll just wrap up by saying that a great minister once said, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, that everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subjects and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. And thank you, United Methodist Women.
Thank you so much, Denise, for speaking and sharing and beginning with your own narrative with transportation and also what that means very concretely in areas where we can collaborate. Denise, I know you will have to head off before we get to Q&A, but I noted Kathy Cox had a question, so I'm just going to read that aloud. I'm concerned about a story coming out of Chicago in which a metal recycling factory business wants to move from a mostly white neighborhood downriver to part of the town. How can this be right or justified? Has anyone heard about this? So would you be able to comment on that? I know you've seen a lot of such activities happening, unfortunately.
Well, that is, I think, historically and systemically been a pattern. And I trust that many of the environmental justice and grassroots groups there are already organizing or will organize to lift up and call for what they want and need for their communities. So if the community does not want to have it placed into their communities, then I trust they will write the necessary petitions, call for their council people and so forth, and advocate for what will be just and equitable for them.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to now hand it over. We're going to next move to Bob, who will be Bob Youngke, who will be speaking around transportation and climate change as well. And I would encourage you all to take notes in certain actions, as you have done with Denise, and how we as United Methodist Women in your particular context can get involved. And as you're doing that, there was a question with regards to Global South and what that includes. Global South is a political term, not only in terms of geographical term, which often it's been shift from developing countries, because it has a question of, well, what does development look like? So that's a political term that encompasses countries that have disproportionately not benefited from the current international development and economic development that has been going on. So, and in the international sphere that does not have as much political and economic clout. So just wanted to note that. In the meantime, since as we're waiting, if folks have questions for Denise, because she won't be able to join for the Q&A, or for Carla, please type those in. And I appreciated Denise mentioning the Transit Equity Day, and Carla as well, as some of the actions, as UMW also participated in that. And there's such a need to tie in the equity and justice framework into the climate solutions that we're talking and speaking about.
Liz, this is Denise. I would like to say that Lynn in the chat asked a question about the transportation and how much greenhouse gases it uses, and that she had an understanding of it being about 40%. And I do think she's correct. This information I put, which I thought I interpreted correctly from the Policy Institute, used 29% in comparison to like 20 some odd percent of electric generation. But I do believe the transportation sector is 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm thinking you probably have
Yeah,
a
and
good
Bob
reference
may
for
be able to comment on that. For EPA, it does say it is 28 point something percent. Bob, can you hear us? Thank you all for your patience as you're figuring this out. I will go through some of the, I'm going to share my screen. I actually heard Bob speak at another event. And so what he has to share is very important. And some of this is going to feel like the cart before the horse. So thank you for your grace in that process. So what does it mean for us as United Methodist Women and Friends to respond to both what Carla has shared personally, what Denise had given us context and framing for, and all the intersections that exist, and what Bob, you will hear from Bob, to what we can do with regards to climate change, climate justice, and transportation. We recognize some of the things that we can do is very much at the state level, right? And so whether it's with the Volkswagen settlement and funds that are available at the municipal, at the city or the state level, and there's been activities, for instance, in Los Angeles using the Volkswagen settlement funds to electrify school buses and public transit. So there are avenues that exist, and I think Bob will also speak about that more as well. Another incredibly important thing is to communicate. For me anyway, often when I've heard people talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, it's primarily been focused on buildings, right? Energy efficiency, our lights, maybe changing and electrifying the type of energy we are receiving and that we're using and consuming. So to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, there hasn't been as much conversation about transportation. And I think in recent years, there has been an increase in such conversations. And I think it's important for us as people of faith to think about that as well. I'm curious how many of you have church vans, church vehicles, and if you have parking lots in your church buildings, right? I know it's COVID times, so for some of us, those are not in use very actively these days, but those might be considerations. Denise was speaking about charging stations. I know for us in New York City, there's a desire to go towards electric vehicles. But for those who are car owners, there aren't many charging stations, and many do not own homes with garages. Many park their cars on streets. And so the possibility of placing charging stations in locations where those who are renters, those who are in transit, or even at churches, so that we are encouraging and supporting the move to zero emission vehicles. That'll be both beneficial for the climate as well for air pollution impacts as well. So those are things I would encourage us to consider in some concrete ways of, even beginning those conversations in our church communities, right? Are we going to be electrifying our church vans and buses? What about our own cars and our next purchase that we may make? But more than that, it's connected to the larger transit system and access. And many of you had noted in your chat comments about the possibility, right, of transit, how it currently in our transportation transit system, it impacts communities of color, it impacts low-income communities, the ability to access jobs, to get to jobs. Carla was speaking about that in her own personal account as well. So we need a transit system and infrastructure change that would not only move towards renewable energy, but allow for a broader transit system that is much more just and equitable. One of the things I wanted to lift up that we will be doing is on April 14th, we will be having legislative days. And it will be focused on climate advocacy and climate justice. So April 14th, if you haven't done so already, please mark that. That's a day before taxes. And what we will do is reach out to our House Representatives and our senators to urge them to prioritize climate justice in their legislation. And it's a unique opportunity. The past few years, we had not focused on that as much because the Senate and House side and the administration was not supportive. So we were doing much more defense, but this is an opportunity. You may have noticed President Biden's proposals, various executive orders that are moving in a direction that supports climate justice. We want to make sure that there's equity as part of that, and we want to make sure that transportation is part of that solution. And if transportation and infrastructure is part of that solution, we want to make sure that there is jobs that pay well, that there's a living wage, that communities of color, those impacted frontline communities are able to benefit from those jobs, and that there's infrastructure as well. And if we're going to have electrify the system, will it be for school buses? Will it be for public transit? Or will it only be for private vehicles, right? Because there's an equity issue there as well. So I wanted to note that, so please register and join us. The training will actually be in our next monthly call, March 17th, and we will be doing pre-briefings. So some of you may feel very shy and say, well, I haven't done this before, or I've done it, but I've never done it in a virtual setting. And we're working with the NRPE to provide training for you on March 17th, pre-briefing April 12th and 13th, and on April 14th, we'll be doing legislative days itself. And then we'll debrief on April 15th. So hope that's some good, helpful information. Cart before the horse, but thank you for working with us in this. And I am going to hand it back to Bob. Bob, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Great. Yes, praise the Lord.
Okay, we've solved that problem. Wonderful.
If you can now share your screen.
Okay, it's not showing?
Not yet. So if you click on share screen.
Yet. All right. I have to get back to that. Okay.
And as you're doing that, I see comments on the side. Just looking at the notes now, Kathy Cox has said our churches could put solar on roofs to funnel energy to charging stations. Absolutely. Cynthia, you had asked, are there solar powered charging stations that churches can either purchase or construct? Yes. And we will be having a conversation sometime later this year with, as part of the Solar Equity Initiative that NAACP is leading, and we're part of NAACP's SEI, the initiative, that will be looking at more of, charging stations and batteries and all of those things as well. So great question. Okay, Bob, over to you.
Can you see the screen now?
We do, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So the key points to know about the climate science, which you can spend years studying, are boiled down to two here. One is that I don't know what's going on here. I just got a new screen. One is that the planet will continue to heat up until we get to zero greenhouse gas emissions. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has called for achieving zero emissions as one of its targets for 2050. And that once we get to zero emissions, the planet will continue to remain at that temperature level for centuries, because it will take that much time for the pollutants that we put into the atmosphere to be removed from the atmosphere in order to return us to levels when all of the natural systems on the planet were adapted for the last 8,000 years. So our first challenge is to get to zero emissions, and the next challenge is to develop strategies for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the main tool for doing that is growing trees. Now, at the current temperature level, 1.2, we're seeing massive impacts of climate change already. In Australia, the fires last year burned 30 million acres, which is virtually the size of New England. There were massive fires in Siberia that you don't hear much about, Canada, and the US Intermountain West in 2020 experienced 10 million acres of fire damage. These are massive increases compared to even 5 and 8 years ago. And that's because the temperature around the planet is now rising faster than it had over the last century. And other impacts include a large number of Category 5 hurricanes, which used to be very rare. We had a number of them this year, more than ever. Flooding in areas around the country that some of you may be familiar with, and extreme drought, particularly in the Southwest. And the drought contributes to the forests burning. So on the current track, we're expected to be at 1.5 degrees centigrade above the historical background by 2032 to 2035, unless we make major changes. And the IPCC has called for roughly a 50% reduction in emissions between now and 2030 in order to postpone the point at which we reach 1.5 degrees. And their goal is to put that off to 2050 in order to give us time to change our energy system to get to zero emissions. Yeah, the next slide addresses the point that Denise was talking about. The latest data for 2019 shows that transportation accounts for 37% of total CO2 emissions from the United States. So it's the largest sector in terms of climate impact of any of the economic sectors in the American economy. Yeah, so the breakdown is that gasoline is 57%, vehicles that burn various forms of diesel are 25%, aviation 14%, and the other is 4%. So what this is telling us is that in order to get to zero emissions, we have to replace the engines that burn these fuels with zero emission technologies. Next. And as Denise also was explaining, the burning of carbon is the primary source of almost all air pollution in the United States. So carbon fuels burned in vehicles, burned in power plants, burned in industrial processes, also produce all of the other co-pollutants that have the adverse health effects that are experienced by all of us, but particularly the EJ communities. The primary pollutant that causes the most mortality is particulate matter, smaller than 2.5 microns in size, and that's otherwise referred to as fine particles. Those fine particles in the latest research that's been published are estimated to account for roughly 200,000 premature deaths in the United States annually. Now those are the emissions associated with burning carbon. If we stop burning carbon, we will clean up the atmosphere for most of the pollutants that adversely affect public health. So for example, if we stop burning petroleum fuels in vehicles, we will clean up the smog that pollutes our cities and that causes the conditions that contribute to childhood asthma. And we have the opportunity here by transforming the transport sector to eliminate most of the urban smog, and to make our cities clean places to raise children. We also have to keep in mind that if we stop burning petroleum fuels in our vehicles, we not only clean up the emissions from tailpipes, we also clean up the emissions from refineries, from fracking that occurs in neighborhoods all over the country. We clean up the emissions from the fuel transport system. We will no longer need new pipelines. We will no longer need oil trains, oil tankers, fuel trucks, storage tanks. All of those things that are part of the petroleum fuel cycle will mostly be gone. We currently have 137 refineries around the country. Each one of those refineries is a major source of pollution for the communities where they're located. And most of the neighborhoods near the refineries are either low income or communities of color. Because people with money who can afford to live somewhere else do not choose to live near a refinery. So when we transform our transport system to eliminate the use of these fuels, we will also protect those communities that are most affected by the other sources in the petroleum fuel cycle. Next. So what we're challenged by here is replacing 275 million on-road vehicles in the U.S. today. Only 2%, roughly 1%, little less than 1% of them, or 2 million, are zero-emission vehicles today. And by 2030, we will have roughly 300 million vehicles, most of which will still be internal combustion engines burning fossil fuels. In order to get to zero emissions by 2050, all 300 million of those vehicles will need to be replaced. The replacement time cycle for light-duty vehicles in the United States is 98% every 20 years. So between 2030 and 2050, during that 20-year time horizon, we have the opportunity to replace all 300 million vehicles without telling people that they have to give up their vehicle, because they will normally be replacing those vehicles on their own. The important step is to make sure that the new vehicles that are available after 2030 are all zero emission. Next. So if we have 100% of sales beginning in 2030, we can achieve the target of zero emissions by 2050. But most of the proposals that have been announced publicly by elected officials like Governor Newsom in California have targeted the 2035 deadline as the deadline for the production and sale of zero emission vehicles. What that means is that there will be roughly 85 million new vehicles sold in the US between 2030 and 2035. That 5-year delay may not sound like a lot, but it actually represents roughly 25% of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere from the transport sector today, and will make it impossible to get to zero emissions by 2050. So the 2030 deadline is really critical. And that is the major policy debate that's going on in Congress and in California Air Resources Board and at state legislatures around the country. What is the appropriate deadline? Next. This is a study that was done comparing the 2035 deadline and the 2030 deadline in California. What you say in the gray bars is the total number of vehicles on the road in California. And you can see that that grows over time from less than 25 million to nearly 35 million over this time period. If we set the deadline as 2030, after which all new vehicles have to be clean, have to be zero emission. We can get to a zero emission outcome. In other words, all vehicles being 100% zero emission by 2045. This is an important distinction compared to the 2035 deadline, where we will still leave millions of vehicles, roughly 5 million vehicles on the road when we get to 2045, that will still be emitting fossil fuels. I mean, still be emitting carbon and the byproducts of fossil fuels, the pollutants that pollute our cities. If we did nothing at all, it would be the blue line on the bottom, where the current rate of adoption of electric vehicles is reflected. If we have no deadline for the automakers to produce zero emission vehicles, we would likely only be at about 4 million zero emission vehicles by 2045, which leaves us with an enormous climate gap and a lot of pollution. In fact, we would actually have more pollution coming into the atmosphere if we just let electric vehicle market forces determine how many vehicles are zero emission by 2045. Next. Now, what's important here, this is what happens to emissions from the vehicles on these three different scenarios. What you see here is that the difference between the red line and the green line is roughly half of the emissions that would occur with the 2035 deadline. Half of the emissions with the 2035 deadline would be eliminated if we go with the 2030 deadline by the time we get to 2045. Now, what's important here is the area under the curve. In other words, the entire timeline from 2020 to 2045 determines what the total emissions into the atmosphere will be. And what this is telling us is that we can cut total emissions by half compared to a 2035 deadline if we require 100% zero emission vehicles by 2030. So it seems like a small difference when you're arguing about 2030 versus 2035. But when you look at the numbers, what you see is that it will actually reduce the total emissions between now and 2045 by half. Next slide. Now, part of the problem here is the political acceptance of going to zero emission vehicles. There are three barriers to public acceptance. One is the cost. The cost of purchasing a new zero emission vehicle, an electric vehicle, is higher today than an internal combustion engine. But the cost of ownership, which includes not only the purchase price, but also the fuel cost over the life of that vehicle and the maintenance costs, are already less than an internal combustion engine. So the critical point here is helping people get over the initial purchase price, giving them incentives or tax rebates or other ways of helping them get into an electric vehicle. Because once we get the country converted to electric vehicles, the economy is going to benefit by roughly $220 billion annually that will be saved by not paying for petroleum fuels. In other words, the cost of electricity is roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the cost of petroleum fuels. And that adds up to $220 billion annually that we will not be spending on fuel if we make the switch. Nationally, that has a huge economic benefit. That money stays in local communities. It stays in the pockets of families who will then spend that money on something other than their transportation budget. And the economic analysis shows that keeping that money in the local economy will create 16 jobs for every job lost in the oil patch. So instead of sending our money to the oil companies and making the oil companies profits, we will be keeping that money in our local economies and enhancing the job opportunities for people, especially in low income and communities of color. Now, the second barrier to access for most people, or acceptance, is convenient access to charging. And President Biden has committed to investing in a national charging network that will create at least 500,000 charging stations around the country. But as a practical matter, what we really need to do is to make sure that charging is available when cars are parked at night. So where people sleep is where the cars need to be able to charge. And we want to do that for a number of reasons. One is that's the most convenient. When you can wake up in the morning and get into a car with a full battery, you don't have to worry about where you're going. You don't have to stop and wait for a charge. It's all ready to go. That's what I do. I have an electric car. We charge at home. And whenever we want to go anywhere, we start with a full battery. It's very convenient. I haven't been in a gas station for 5 years now. And that means that we have to put charging stations in multifamily dwellings. Because 45% of Americans live in multifamily dwellings. And that particularly includes low income and people of color tend to occupy multifamily dwellings more than white folks. And that means that that's where we need to put the charging stations so that people who live in those multifamily situations will have convenient access to charging. And then the third barrier to public acceptance has been the range of electric vehicles. When they first came out in 2010, for example, the Nissan Leaf only had a 60-mile range, and that was very limiting. It was okay if you just drove to the supermarket and back, but not if you wanted to go much further. But now, the new cars that are coming out, the latest Chevy Bolt, for example, has a range of 230 miles, which is more than most people drive in 2 or 3 days. And it allows you to make long distance trips. You can make a 500-mile trip with one stop for a charge along the way. And these high-speed charging stations on the interstate highways can charge a car in 20 minutes. Gives you enough time to go in and go to the bathroom and get your coffee. So the range issue is being solved. And that's thanks to investments from the industry. Next. This is a slide showing the cost of electric vehicles compared to internal combustion engine vehicles. And in the lower right-hand corner is the lowest cost vehicle, which is a Nissan Leaf. And that includes both the purchase price and the fuel costs over the life of the vehicle and the maintenance costs. The maintenance costs are much less. I've not had any maintenance done on my electric vehicle for the 5 years I've owned it. Nothing needs to be done except to replace the windshield wipers. It only has 22 moving parts, whereas an internal combustion engine vehicle has over 1,000 moving parts. You know, there's no carburetor, there's no fuel pump, there's no fuel tank, there's nothing of the kinds of things that require maintenance on an internal combustion engine. So those costs are very low. And this is what makes it possible. If we can help people get over the initial purchase price, it makes it possible to provide real benefits for low-income families if we can get them into an electric vehicle. Next. So for the 2030 target, which is to reduce our national CO2 emissions by half, Senator Schumer has proposed a bill that would provide rebates for people who buy either a new or a used electric vehicle. So we're not going to limit the benefits here to just buying new. Because most people in this country don't buy new cars. Most people buy used cars. And now there's an emerging market for used electric vehicles. They're quite reasonable. I had to replace mine recently because I was in a car crash and I got a used one. And the price was quite comparable to internal combustion engines. And what Senator Schumer has proposed would be a program where if you bring in your internal combustion engine vehicle and agree to have it scrapped so it's no longer on the road, that you would get a substantial rebate check that would be applied to the purchase of an electric vehicle. And so you could either purchase a new electric or a used electric. And the one thing that we're suggesting be added to that program is that people have the option of choosing not to buy a new vehicle and still getting the credit, is perhaps in the form of a transit voucher that would be worth $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000. That would provide transit access for a family for years, for 4 or 5 years, so that people could have the option of either replacing their vehicle with another one, or if they're properly situated in relation to their job and school and whatever, they would also have the option of taking that benefit in the form of transit service. And next. Now, what we're calling for, a number of organizations in U.S. Climate Action Network have sent a letter to Congress asking Congress to implement the 2030 deadline, which is part of the VICA document that Liz referenced earlier, the Vision for Equitable Climate Action. That letter is available on the website associated with this call. You can download it. It provides the rationale for why we should have a 2030 deadline in federal legislation. And we've encouraged the members of the organizations that have signed that letter to write your congressperson or your senators, asking them to support this 2030 deadline. Now, EPA could possibly do this under current law, under the Clean Air Act, to set a deadline, but the Biden administration has not yet announced a commitment to do that. And we're asking for a law, having Congress require it, because it's quicker than a rulemaking, which EPA would have to go through in order to adopt this requirement. And if the law is passed by Congress, it can't be challenged in the courts, whereas an EPA regulation would spend years being challenged in the courts. It also would prevent another president who was hostile to climate policies from withdrawing the program by scuttling the rule, the EPA rule, which can always be reversed by a future president. And also, we need Congress to appropriate the funds to invest in charging networks and the Senator Schumer proposal for buying and scrapping older vehicles. So we need congressional action. That's why we've asked members of the various organizations to write to their member of Congress. And we would encourage you to do the same thing. Next. Now, one of the reasons for convincing Congress to enact a zero emission standard are the public health benefits. And Denise spoke quite a bit about that, but I want to emphasize some key points here. One is that there are 132 million Americans who live in the 201 urban counties that are in violation of the National Smog Standard. Those 132 million Americans living in urban counties are disproportionately represented by low-income families and people of color. That's one of the reasons why the incidence of asthma among children is twice as high among Black children as it is among white children, is because the Black kids live in the areas that are most polluted. So that asthma number reflects their exposure to the pollutants from burning carbon. And there's also the evidence, the recent evidence, which and there's a site there for you to log on to if you want to read it, explaining the estimate that 240,000 Americans die prematurely each year from exposure to the co-pollutants emitted from burning carbon. Now, the portion of that from just tailpipe emissions is roughly 10%, or I'm sorry, 20%. So somewhere in the order of 40,000 of those deaths are attributable just to tailpipe pollution. But a lot of those deaths occur in the communities adjacent to highways. The pollution levels for particulate matter are as much as 25 to 40% higher in communities adjacent to highways compared to neighborhoods in cities that are farther away from traffic. So those communities are also usually communities of color. And that's why that's a particularly important strategy for protecting those communities. So we would urge you, if you are concerned about these issues and want to support the communities that are most affected by exposure to these pollutants, to write your member of Congress.
Liz, you're muted.
Thank you, Bob. We are at near at time, and there's so much good things in here. So what we are going to do is share your slides, and this will also be recorded. And I know it's so important in terms of what you're saying. We will be going into some more of the details of this in future Just Energy for All trainings around transportation. And we're so grateful, Bob, that you can join us in the conversation in really framing and giving us a high level overview. And it's clear you've been doing this for decades. And there are a number of questions that have come up. So what I'm gonna propose is this. We're going to close in prayer. And Nikki Fullerton, one of our United Methodist women, is going to close us in prayer. And I'm going to invite, for those who are interested in staying past our 4:30 mark, and if Bob, if you're able, that we can stay for another about 15 minutes or so. I've collected the questions to go back and forth in a conversation with those questions. Would that be okay for you, Bob?
Oh, I can stay as long as there are folks who are curious and have questions. I'm happy to spend my time that way.
Wonderful, thank you. Great, Bob, thank you so much. There's a lot here, folks, and I know we're not sharing everything right now. And we will be sharing the slides with you in how you can dig into the material more. One of the resources that Bob was speaking about is also the Vision for Equitable Climate Action. We'll be sharing that link with you as well. And we'll stay for Q&A for a bit afterwards. But Nikki Fullerton, if you can join, if you can lead us in the closing prayer, that would be wonderful. Nikki, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for asking me. If you can join me in prayer. Gracious God, God of love, of life and light, we leave this afternoon with our whole hearts, knowing that we're not alone and that there's hope. Our hearts are open in grateful praise for this earth that is not ours to exploit, but yours entrusted to our care. Open our eyes to see you and all of your creation. God, we're grateful for those who bring awareness to harmful effects of our transportation systems and those working to bring about change in our attitudes. Forgive us when we fail to listen, when we hear but don't accept the challenge. We confess too often we make good things bad by using more than we need. We acknowledge that our present behaviors are abusive. Enlighten us to appreciate the balance of your glorious creation. Continue to inspire us to conserve and care for this earth we share. Grant us wisdom to be faithful stewards and the courage to work for change. Give us the faith and resolve to act differently and be content with less. Blessings upon the United Methodist Women's prophetic voice in raising the moral issue of climate justice. Bless our national and local UMW leaders for inspiring us to revere and care for creation. Today, we're grateful for these presenters and illuminating these issues. We offer blessings and prayers for our world leaders making life-giving decisions. For them, I pray courage to take swift action. We pray for courageous actions to replace carbon emissions with clean and renewable energy. We pray that we might bring an end to our dependence on fossil fuel and transition to a green economy and more just transportation systems. I pray that love and wisdom might inspire our choices and actions. I offer special prayers for victims of climate injustice, for the negative impact, especially on women, children, and the most vulnerable. We pray for lifestyles that preserve creation for present and all future generations. On this day of repentance in the season of denial and always, may we bring all honor and glory to you in everything we do. In Jesus' name we believe and pray. Amen and amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for that powerful prayer. And if you're willing to share that prayer with us, we would love to post that somewhere too. Thank you. So thank you all for being with us. I'm cognizant that a number of you have to jump off, but for those of you who can, we will have this included as part of the recording, so you'll be able to come back to this afterwards. So I've grouped some of the points. I don't think I'm sharing my screen, so that's good. Okay, so first, I think I want to get into about lithium batteries, right? Because that is such a huge part of zero emission vehicles right now. And this is from Judy Halverson. I'm wondering if lithium batteries will be a sustainable staple for electric cars. Will there be issues of environmental justice for extraction of lithium? Is there other means for zero emission vehicles to operate beside the lithium battery? And this relates to batteries and retrofit. So from Janice Stevens says, can an internal combustion engine vehicle be retrofitted to an electric vehicle or hybrid? So why don't we start there, Bob?
Batteries, okay, yeah, that's a very hot topic. The lithium battery industry is exploding, because electric vehicles are finally making it into the market around the planet. So Europe and China are actually way ahead of us in replacing their internal combustion engines with zero emission vehicles. And when we talk about zero emission vehicles, it's important to remember that there are multiple technologies that satisfy that requirement. One of them is hydrogen fuel cells. Hydrogen fuel cells are at an early stage of development. That they've reached the point of commercialization. They can be deployed now, but they're generally only, those kind of vehicles are generally only available in Southern California because it's the only place where there are hydrogen fueling stations. So the hydrogen fueling network does not exist. And for that technology to expand around the country, hydrogen fuel stations will have to be developed. That's one of the reasons why everybody's focused on electric vehicles, because electricity is everywhere. Everybody has electricity in their home, and you can find a way to plug in a car. The lithium ion battery is the current technology of choice for electric vehicles, but there are other chemistries being developed for electric vehicle batteries. Those chemistries are now emerging from the development stage into the commercialization stage and will be available probably within the next 2 to 3 years. So we're not going to be dependent exclusively on lithium. Some of these other battery technologies are the reason why a battery range will grow, because they have the potential for having charges that will last 300, 400, 500 miles instead of 230 miles today for the lithium ion batteries. Now, California has a program in place for developing lithium ion battery recycling. California recognizes that lithium is a limited resource on the planet. And while there's a lot more to be extracted, we certainly haven't exhausted the Earth's supply. What makes sense is recycling the lithium in batteries that reach the end of their useful life. And that's now in the development stage. It doesn't currently exist, the recycling program, but it's a primary objective of the California program. And we expect it to be available by the end of the decade. In other words, we won't be throwing lithium ion batteries away. We will be reusing them. The other thing that's really good news is that now that the lithium ion batteries have been on the road for 10 years, we're discovering that they actually last longer than was originally estimated by the manufacturers. So the original manufacturers, like Nissan for the Nissan Leaf, offered an 8-year warranty for the battery. And that's still their warranty, it's 8 years, which is very good. That's a long period of time. But we're discovering now that the battery capacity that was expected to be seriously depleted soon after an 8-year time horizon is not happening. And that the batteries are much more likely to last 12, maybe 15 years. So we're not going to need to recycle them as quickly as we originally thought. And we're not going to need as much lithium to start with if we're not replacing the batteries as soon as we thought. So a lot of things are happening in this space, and we have to pay attention. But all of the technological advances are happening faster than expected and moving in the right direction. It's an excellent technology. We should take advantage of it.
Great. Thanks, Bob, for that. And I think you answered a number of questions on that. So I'm going to move to hybrid. So this is from Janice Stevens. How much difference, if any, do hybrid vehicles make currently? And from Fran Lynch, could hybrid cars be a positive migration path to all electric for those uncertain and mitigate cost concern? Cost of operation, fuel consumption has fallen dramatically.
Right. The hybrid was the first product that came out with electric batteries because back in 2008, 2009, when the hybrids first came on the road, electric battery capacity was quite limited. 60 miles was the most we could get out of it. And for people who needed to drive farther than that, they had to be able to switch from their battery to use gasoline to get where they were going. So that's much less important now as battery range has increased very significantly and will continue to do so in the future. So the real question is, how much driving do you do that's longer than the distance you can drive on a battery in a hybrid? So a hybrid battery normally will get you between 18 and 20 miles before you switch over to gasoline. They're not designed to be for long distance trips. If your daily driving is less than 20 miles, in other words, is less than the distance you can get to on your battery, it doesn't make much difference that you have a hybrid. But if you're driving more than that, then you're driving on gasoline. And so it's self-defeating. If you have a 100-mile trip every day to wherever you're going and back, you would want to switch to an all electric, now that the battery range can get you to 100 miles and back easily. That the original motivation, for having a hybrid, because the battery distance was so short, is no longer an obstacle to these longer trips in an all electric vehicle.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a few. One is about charging stations, was discussed a bit, but who pays, or how would use of charging stations be paid for at a multifamily dwelling? And so thinking about infrastructure. And then trucks, heavy duty vehicles. So, and that's, sorry, the previous one was from Cynthia Taylor. This is from Pat Davis. And how does the push for going electric affect the trucking industry? Won't we still need gas to keep this industry working?
Okay, the multifamily dwelling problem is a difficult nut to crack. You know, zoning and building codes would normally be the way that we upgrade the structures and the services provided by a landlord. And the problem with that is the building codes generally only apply to new construction or to reconstruction. They don't apply to existing structures that are not changed. So one of the things that we've been looking at is the possibility of requiring owners of structures to upgrade their structure when there's a change in title. In other words, if they are selling the property to a new owner, in order to complete the transfer of title, the new owner would have to make sure that zoning requirements or building code requirements were met in the structure. And that's normally when there's a lot of money on the table. New buyers of structures normally have a lot of resources that could be used to retrofit charging stations into the parking areas for multifamily dwellings. Now, you know, that's a problem that can be solved if there's enough parking places for the occupants of the dwelling. But if people are parking on the street and they don't have parking in their structure, in their building, then we have to take another approach. And what they've been doing in Europe is, you know, every light pole on the street has electricity to it. So they're putting charging stations at every light pole. So that means that at least 2 cars can plug in at that light pole. And that's one way to help address the street parking problem. But it's going to take some time to get those things in place. And economic incentives like tax rebates for the owners of multifamily structures would also play a role here, could play a role. Now, the heavy duty vehicle situation is one that is evolving very rapidly. The manufacturers are finally coming out with commercial EVs for both heavy duty trucks and pickup trucks and medium duty vehicles. Now, transit buses have been electrified for the last 10 years. They're currently available. The problem is we've got to get transit agencies the resources to transform their energy systems because they have to replace all their buses with electric for that to work. And before they can even buy one electric bus, they have to put in the electric charging capacity at the bus yards in order to accommodate the electric buses. So this is also a situation where there's an upfront cost and ultimate savings from the fuel savings for the transit agencies are really, really quite large, but those are accumulated over time. And we need Congress to step up and help the transit agencies make the initial investment. And there are bills for that right now pending in Congress.
Thank you, Bob, for that. And just to add on that, there's been some interesting work between the utility sectors and also transportation, as the utility sector sees an opportunity to have a new customer base, that they are in conversation with transit systems so that, and also school buses, et cetera. So with all of those things, we want to ensure that there's equity that is being centered. And so the questions that are coming from our members, I think, is so incredibly important because who is it impacting? Even the question of lithium batteries, right? We're just not saying we support it because it's reducing emissions, we want to make sure that there is just transition, communities are being protected. So I just want to affirm our members and others who are on this call for lifting up those components. What about corn fuel plants? This is from Kathleen Billett. Also the tech that they are developing to capture emissions, so carbon capture sequestration, I assume is kind of part of the conversations. So biofuels, and I know some, and bioenergy, some transit systems have moved in that direction. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, biofuels are very controversial because you're still burning carbon and you're still adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's less than if you were burning a petroleum fuel, but it's still carbon. And ultimately, we've got to get to zero emissions. So using corn carbon to fuel our engines is not a solution that meets the needs of the climate, to stabilize the climate. So ultimately, we have to move beyond that. But for the moment, supplementing petroleum fuels with some biofuels has the advantage of reducing the total emissions while we make the transition to electric or zero emission technologies.
Thank you. And just building on what you had said, Bob, it's similar to the pipeline conversation where if we start building pipelines, we are stuck with that infrastructure development, right? So if there's investment in buses that are biomass or biofuel, bioenergy driven buses, then the cost of return and our waiting period to move towards zero emission vehicles is that much longer. So I think bringing in the moral and the faith kind of urgency is also very important.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind is, we're not just concerned about climate here. We're concerned about the air pollution impacts on communities that are most exposed to the pollutants that come from burning carbon. And when you're burning carbon, whether it comes from corn or it comes from oil in the earth, you're still producing those co-pollutants and you're still contaminating those neighborhoods that are closest to highways or bus terminals or whatever. So if we have to, that's why the congressional letter that the USCAN organizations sent a couple months ago highlights the benefit of getting rid of air pollution from our cities. We're really not just transforming our energy system, we're transforming the air quality of our cities, making them potentially clean for the first time since the beginning of the industrial age. We've had polluted cities for almost 200 years, and we can make them safe places for children, and that should not be minimized. That is one of the most important benefits here.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, for being with us. And if I missed some questions, my apologies. I was kind of scrolling through the chat box. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you for Carla, for Nikki for doing the prayer, and Rhonda as well in the beginning, for Denise, who is no longer with us, but on the call, but speaking, for Bob for your contribution as well. Just a reminder, our next call will be around training for how do we do federal legislative action, and transportation will be one of the talking points that we will be focusing on, which is in alignment with VICA, the U.S. Climate Action Network's proposal. For those of you who have not joined our previous Just Energy for All 101 calls, I would encourage you to sign up. February 22nd, March 8th, and March 22nd. It's really baseline. What do we mean is just energy? Why should I care? And how do I advance it? So thank you again, everyone. Bob, thank you so much for staying on even further. If you have additional resources, please email them to us, Bob, and then we can share this out to our members as well. I know there was a question around what is the letter that you can sign onto a draft letter. And I think with the Elders Climate Action Network on the webpage, they have some template letters that you can use. United Methodist Women will also be developing some letters so that it notes very specifically as people of faith, as United Methodists, and we'll put in some resolution language. We are urging our representatives to move towards clean, 100% renewable energy.
And you have our congressional letter, right?
Yes, we do. We have your letter as well. So we can use it.
People can crib from that.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. Blessings to you all. And I look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks, Bob. Take care.
Thank you.